Hi, my name is Jayce Taylor. I'm a sophomore at New Trier High School, and for the Judy Gressel Contest, I wrote a story called For the Love of the Revolution. The morning light filtered through the city window, which is cracked and broken, letting an uneasy puff of wind blow thousands of dust particles into the air. They careened this way and that, floating on visible strings before settling down again on what little furniture there was in the room. A handful of lone particles lighted upon a small area of exposed flesh, causing it to twitch and wrinkle involuntarily. A roar ripped through the undisturbed silence in the small room, disturbing the dust once again. Throwing off covers that were little more than rags, the only human occupant in the room stretched and floundered until he had found stable footing at the end of his bed. Wearily, he drew his fingers through his unruly hair, attempting to comb through frayed, dark locks. Rubbing tired eyes, he stretched, skin pulling tight over protruding bones and almost non-existing muscle. He stood and walked into the adjoining room to fix a breakfast of stale bread and watery coffee, then back into his bedroom to pick out his best attire, then into the washing basin in the corner of the room to splash cold water in his sleep-filled eyes. He pulled on his shirt, his overcoat, his trousers, socks, shoes, and cravat, and slicked his hair back into the ponytail at the base of his neck. He studied himself in the cracked mirror on the wall, examining his distorted complexion. Wide blue eyes stared back, now clear from the fatigue of the early morning. He studied a slightly crooked nose, dark bags under eyes, hollow cheeks, and narrow lips that drew up in a smile as he thought of his day ahead. A spring was in his step as he trotted down the street, heading towards the center of town. Few people were outside this early, a lone baker here, a sole merchant there. Hardly anyone would be at work today, close to none. It was a holiday, a day to be remembered and celebrated in a new era of time. The enemies of the Republic, who for so long had been the ones in control, were now going to pay for their crimes. The death that they caused, the destruction that they brought, it would all be paid for with their lives. Just the thought made his toes curl in his shoes and his heart beat faster. But first came work. Not that he was complaining. With work came the opportunity to be here near his beloved, the one he cherished and held dear to his heart. Her slender body, taller than himself, was a sight to behold. Every one who had the luxury or the misfortune to be graced by her presence felt her power and elegance. She was beautiful. He thanked his lucky stars that his job involved being with her all day, and sometimes all night. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden end of the street he was on, which had opened up into a large plaza surrounded by buildings. He slowed his pace, and almost delicately he approached the center of the plaza, hardly breathing, hardly thinking. When he reached a set of stairs leading up onto a scaffold, he stopped and stared. Before him stood his love, the guillotine. She stood tall and proud before the empty plaza, the queen of justice surveying her waking kingdom. Today she would be dealing with those who dare abuse her power for themselves and not the republic she loved so dearly. It was his duty to ensure that she looked her finest for the ceremony. Bringing out his tools from under the scaffold, he climbed the stairs, determination in his eyes as he smiled up at her. First was to remove any blood from her latest tirade that had dried itself upon her being. He dipped a cloth into a jar of water and set about cleaning her. First there was the lunette, or guillotine's jaws, which binds the victim's head in place, lest they flinch. Next, he cleaned her frame from the blood in which it had been caked, now dried to a reddish brown. Then he pulled the release handle and watched as her blade fell through the air with a satisfying swish before landing gracefully before him. He rinsed the blood from his used cloth and brought it towards the blade. Stroking her blade gently, he washed the previous day's work from her edge. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of dried blood and day-old fear, a scent he found enticing, but completely unique to her. He stood there, cleaning and drying, and re-cleaning and re-drying her blade for upwards of a half an hour, forever reveling in her company. When he was finished, he pulled her stainless blade back to its set position. The last part to be cleaned was her shield, which protected onlookers and the executioner from the drops of scarlet that so generously rained from la guillotine, embodying the gift of freedom that she lovingly enveloped the children of the Republic in. Turning from his finished task, he noticed that the plaza had started to fill with early onlookers determined to obtain the best view of the action. Steps coming from behind alerted him to his companion in death, the executioner Sanson. "It's a fine morning for a haircut, isn't it, citizen?" Sanson greeted. "It would be unfortunate if anyone lost their head in the process." Stifled guffaws from those who had heard Sanson's quip met his ears. Robespierre's hair has been getting a little long, hasn't it?" another onlooker shouted. More and more people were gathering in the common, and with them the sound of anticipation and the smell of rebels who had been out all night, celebrating the fall of the Republic's foes. Very soon the carts would come clattering into the plaza. His breath sped up, waiting to see his beloved in action, doing what she did best. As soon as the sun was straight above head, the sound of horses and carriages over cobblestone streets could be heard above the din of the crowd that had gathered. A giant roar could be heard as they entered the common, a crowd parting way to make room for them. Those being carried had their heads down, their arms and legs drawn up to hide their faces from the citizens, those actions being in vain, as everyone would see their traitorous faces once they were detached from their bodies and shown to the mob. Few were standing straight, their jaws set in defiance, refusing to believe in the crime that they had committed. One of them, a short man of lean figure, was the receiver of many taunts and threats, as people shook their fists, and some even going as far to fling dung and mud. Yet he held his head high, and refused to even blink in the face of peril. "Down with Robespierre! Down with Robespierre!" the people cried as prisoners were loaded off the cart. 1 in 20 were to be executed that day, all followers of the infamous Robespierre, father of the Reign of Terror and enemy of the Republic. Woos and hisses could be heard from almost everyone in attendance as the first prisoner was brought to the scaffold. Crying for mercy, their head was shoved into the lunette, which was secured around their neck. He and the executioner's helpers held the writhing body still, waiting for the impending swish of air. With much frippery, Sanson laid his hand upon the release handle. The crowd went silent. A strong hand, familiar with this action, pulled the lever and sent the blade dropping from the heavens. With a sickening thwack, the blade drove through the exposed flesh, severing the neck like it were no more than a stick. The head dropped into a basket, where Sanson quickly retrieved it, and held it up as if a great victory had been won. The crowd roared to life, chanting for more blood. La Guillotine had taken her first victim of the day. The next 20 executions went off smoothly, one after another, like clockwork. Lastly, Robespierre himself was beheaded, and the roar of the crowd was deafening at the sight of his severed crown. Everyone was pushing and shoving, trying to get as close as they could to the puddles of blood which were pouring down the scaffold. Some tried to drink it, others sop it up with rags. Still others tried to bathe themselves or their babies in the ruby nectar flowing from that flower that was La Guillotine. It became madder and madder, the people starting to become out of control. They wanted more blood, and they wanted it now. Neighbors volunteered each other, claiming that the other was a traitor, and suggesting that they be executed. Some were, their screams at innocence drowned out by the howl of the people. The mob clawed and grabbed at the executioners and others on the scaffold. Soon one man jumped up from the crowd, grabbing onto the railing and shouting for the executioner and his men to be executed. Had they not followed Robespierre in all his schemes? Had they not been the ones to carry out his orders? Had they not been the ones to take part in the murder of their kin? Should they not also be executed, then, just like their leader? The crowd chanted their approval, and the men on the scaffold were restrained. The question then arose, who would do the executing if the executioner was the one being executed? Sanson was thus pardoned. He was hauled by his arms, which were bound behind his back, up to the guillotine, where they had just finished the executioner's right-hand man. He could see tears at the corner of Sanson's eyes, not daring to fall, for fear of being declared a traitor or soft-hearted. His turn came. He stepped up to his dear, gazing at her frame and not noticing the turmoil surrounding him. He smiled at the irony and perfection of his situation. What better way to die than at the hand of the one you love most? But the one he dedicated his life to fixing and cleaning, the one he had spent every day of the past 5 years with? Nothing could be more fitting, he thought. His head was placed in the lunette, while Guillotine's jaws closing around his neck like an embrace. He sighed contentedly, knowing that his beloved would be well taken care of in the following years of the Revolution. He heard nothing more, the wail of the crowd falling on his deaf ears. He heard nothing but the merciful swish of wind above his head, and then nothing. Lights danced before his eyes, fading and growing, shifting before his unfocused sight. Roaring met his ears as his sight adjusted shortly, allowing him to see a crowd of people cheering. His sight then blurred as he faintly felt the back of his head bump the bottom of a box. He could faintly make out the blue sky above, when as the light faded, the last thing he saw was the shadow of his beloved looming above him, as beautiful as ever.